Welcome back to Raised by Giants live discussion. Good to see everyone. Welcome everyone in the chat and any moderators and channel members out there. And if you're watching on YouTube and X, or if you're listening on the audio only or the replay, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. My social media links are all in the description. The link to watch my documentaries on Amazon Prime and Tubi are also in the description. JFKX, Solving the Crime of the Century, and A Clockwork, Shining in Kubrick's Odyssey 3. I am currently in the process of editing my latest documentary, Psychic Agent, which will be released on Amazon Prime in the coming months. With that down, we are joined today by a man known for a brilliant career as Leo Young in the media and the music industry, as a record producer who quickly became popular on the internet in 2006 because of his direct involvement in the New World Order and secret societies, known to the majority of us as the Illuminati. Ryder, researcher, author, Leo Zagam. Welcome to the show. How are you?
It was a pleasure, and today to be live with you is even a greater pleasure. I think this is the first time, so thank you for having me on, and of course, hello to all your viewers.
Well, it's the first time that you've been on the show on a live broadcast, but we did meet at Contact in the Desert a couple of years ago.
Absolutely.
And we did have a good discussion there, but someone tried to say that I censored you, but that wasn't true at all.
No, absolutely. I can confirm there was nothing edited out of your interview. So
yes. My camera just shut off halfway, shut off on 3 other people.
Yeah, the problem was, I think, with your camera was running out of battery power. Yeah. That's right.
Yes, it did. And it was unfortunate, but I had to condense everybody's interview into one interview to make it long enough because I only had like 15 minutes of each individual. But anyway, that's behind us. We're looking in the future now, Leo. And I guess I'm going to start off with it's a really big question. It's probably going to take you a minute to explain. But why all of this back and forth with the Epstein stuff? It seems like it's kind of been covered up now. We've had so much other things going on. You know, there's files, now there's not files. There was video, now there's not video. There's not video, now there's video, and there's a minute missing out of the video. It's just a really big, confusing mess that's going on right now with Jeffrey Epstein. There's been so much stuff that's happened since then that's kind of taken the spotlight off of that. So your book is a really refreshing thing to happen right now. So tell us what do you think was going on there? Because Trump said that he was going to release the files. He said it on the Sean Ryan show.
Okay, I think that the best way to answer you is to direct your viewers and the potential readers to the introduction of my actual book, where I actually explain very clearly why nothing is going to ever be fully disclosed regarding Epstein. You see, my book gives a unique perspective that there has been hundreds of books written on the Epstein case, as you can imagine. There has been thousands of articles. There has been documentaries. So what else can a journalist add? I add my experience, of course, within secret societies, within religions, especially as somebody who has studied very much Judaism. And so the answers that I provide in this book are more regarding the ancestry of the protagonist and the people who built Epstein from scratch. And that goes from the father of William Barr to Les Wexner, to any other associate of Wexner, being part of the Mega Group, which is this Jewish study group that was founded in the early 90s. And this way, you can really understand the relevance of Jeffrey Epstein and why nothing is going to ever be fully disclosed. Because like I state in the introduction of the book, this will compromise the whole system of Washington, D.C. from A to Z. So it's not just a single political party that will have some serious problems, being the Republican or vice versa, the Democrats. It's the whole system. And so the moment you are really exposing the system, which I talk about in this book, which is a system which was created by a very powerful sect nobody really talks about, if not a few historians relegating it, in history as some kind of sectarian moment or false messiah of the Jews that in the end just dissolved in thin air. It didn't dissolve in thin air, and actually there were historians like Gershon Scholem, who studied very much the Sabbatean and Frankist, who confirmed that nothing was dissolved in thin air. You have to really study the history of contemporary Judaism to understand why you have today a transgender rabbi endorsing Zoran Mandani, or Zoran Mandani being endorsed today by a large number of Hasidic Jews. If you study this book, you understand that in reality the Sabbatean Frankists hid themselves, of course, within the Reform part of Judaism, because that was directly influenced also by what is the Jewish Enlightenment, which was very much influenced by the Sabbatean Frankists. But at the same time, you have also those conservative Jews, which in the end gave themselves birth to other forms of Judaism, who today, like the Reconstructionists, who today are just as bad, and who actually have, let's say, I will not say destroyed, but I will say cherry picking on the Mosaic laws. Now, for those who are viewing us, the Mosaic laws are not only those Sinaitic laws that were given by God on the mountain, those 10 commandments. There is actually 613 precepts that are given within the Torah, the 5 books that in the Old Testament we call the Pentateuch. So the fact that today we are here discussing Jeffrey Epstein is because every time, and you know this, in the last few years, you actually said it in a way when you introduced me, there is a lot of talk, but there is never really any results from all this talk. It's like they get to a certain point, and it's like at that point, it's their excuse is, okay, he was working with the intelligence community. We can't access to that kind of information, so our view of him is restricted or limited by our perception, which of course is limited by the fact we don't have access to those documents or those that reality. And then of course the same can be said also about his involvement with the elite, which, just like in the case of the now former Prince Andrew, is a guy who is so up in the system whereby you can't really know everything about him. In fact, that's why King Charles might have sent him out of the Royal Lodge, but he might have to pay now a 6-figure sum to get him out of the way without him making further damage. So this book is unique in a way because for the first time we don't only see the Sabbatean Frankist evolving within Jewish history, which is also a very important element of this book, which I have tried to summarize in the best way possible, working also with, of course, the material provided by those credible sources, including not only Gershon Scholem, but also the late Rabbi Antelman, and many others who were similarly interested in raising questions about it. And the problem within the academic world surrounding the Sabbatean Frankists to this day in universities in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, is that the moment in which you expose this heresy, you go inevitably and expose part of Judaism, which is still today in charge of things, because you have a state that claims a sort of legitimization through religion, because that's how Israel was built by the Zionists. Now, in my work, I explained how they were forced to accept this return to Israel also. And the role of Jeffrey Epstein is not just a role of, any kind of individual or spy, because he was put in place there as a spy master. He was given a building rigged with cameras in the center of New York, another place, a fantastic place, and facilitated the buying or purchasing of an island for very little amount of money compared to what is the usual amount you pay, or what happened in New Mexico. But at the same time, we are here not in front of a simple pervert. We are in front of a sort of Dr. Frankenstein, who was also very much obsessed by technology. He is apparently involved in the backbone of Sophia the robot, because with his involvement with the actual software of Hanson Robotics that he helped financing, he was directly involved, regardless of what they said about him not being involved with Sophia the robot. And that is already a sort of Frankenstein scenario. And then you have, of course, his will to spread his seed worldwide. He wanted to seed everybody with his DNA, but there was also much more connected to his, let's say, mad scientist slash Frankensteinish kind of view of things, which, by the way, is connected also to a very ancient tradition within Judaism, which is the golem, which is something created out of clay by reciting certain formulas. And of course, the Kabbalists were in charge of that kind of thing, which was then inspirational for Mary Shelley, who in a way was inspired by both the Golem as well as Jacob Frank and his sect, as well as the Illuminati. And of course, we have also the husband who wrote also The Wandering Jew. So it's important that people understand that, first of all, this is not an anti-Semitic book. And that's why very much in the introduction that I wrote also for it, not only the one which is, of course, more extensive at the beginning of the book, but also the one that is simply written on the back cover, I explain that this book is made also to really put some clarity, which means, what it means, this clarity? It means that in the end we are way too often casting a doubt, but also at times a form of racism, of course, sometimes blatant forms of racism against the Jewish people, when the Jewish people have been the first victims of their own sectarian views and of their own rabbis who embraced them. This is very important because in my book, I explain, I used to do this podcast with Roseanne Barr, and she told me once, the worst enemy of the Jew is the Jew. And I said, what do you mean? And then she explained me that. And we agreed, not only with the Sabbatean Frankist, but you have to understand that then you have, if we go back even before the times of Shabbatai Zevi, who, by the way, for those who are following us, was the founder of the Sabbatean movement, and then the sect that became the Dommeh, as well as Jacob Frank, who claimed to be the third reincarnation after Baruch Russo, who was the second reincarnation of this Holy Trinity, which ended with Jacob Frank, who himself, rather than accepting the role of Messiah of the Dommeh, and why I say Dommeh is because in 1666, Shabbatai Zevi, who was believed to be the Messiah by almost half of the population in Europe, Jewish population in Europe, converted to Islam. And so he was rejected by a lot of people for this choice, but there was then a group of really hardcore, believers in him who maintained and who followed this example by becoming crypto-Jews and converted to the Islamic faith outwardly. Now, this kind of modality, and also Jacob Frank will imitate this modality with the Catholics. He will not accept to be simply the reincarnation of Shabbatai and stay there in Salonico, in Thessaloniki, and follow up with the Dommeh. He wanted to do much more, so he went back to the Catholic place he came from, which was nowadays Ukraine, but at the time Poland, and what was I think at the time the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth, and then all this area was part of Podolia. That area which is the area also of modern Ukraine, of Moldova, of Ukraine, of other parts of Eastern Europe, Belarus, and so on. These parts of Europe were seemingly infested by this Sabbatean heresy. And it became even more persistent with Jacob Frank when he brought to the Catholic Church 20,000 Jews to convert in exchange for his nobilitization, like becoming a noble. And then, rather than keeping the sect marrying only with each other, which was his initial idea, he then opened up to marrying with, not only marrying, but getting, every time one of them converted, the surname of the family which will, become their godfathers for the baptism in the Catholic faith. That meant suddenly all these Sabbatean Frankists will insinuate themselves within the aristocracy of Europe, both the black aristocracy close to the Pope, as well as also the Anglican aristocracy in England. And we see that suddenly we have the nobility, the Rothschild family becoming a noble, and in Vienna as well as in England, and then marrying with royalty, with the other aristocratic families. So my book makes, though, a thesis that is very linear, very clear, with credible sources, which I of course cite one by one. I think there is something like probably almost 500, over 500 citations here. No, let me see, because I'm not wearing my glasses. Sorry. So I
need those glasses on sometimes, Leo.
Yeah, sometimes you need the glasses. But in any case, the citations and the sources I use are non-debunkable, because you can understand that when you are attacking the rabbinical system, and I'm like attacking the core of Judaism, and I'm challenging a little bit, like 2,000 years, Jesus was put on a cross for a similar thing. So, I mean, they don't go easy on you if you challenge them. So you want to be very, honest about the sources you have, very transparent. You want to maybe say one is controversial, one is in a certain way, but I regard it as idoneous for citing. It definitely, the sources need to be credited in a way that you will not have any backlash from the academic world. And in fact, this book is presently #1 in the history of Judaism, and in many other sections on Amazon, which have, some of the most eminent historians of Jewish history or of Jewish religion. So I'm glad that you had me on today, so we can maybe describe a little bit better of this.
Yes, and the really strange part about, I mean, you're correct in a lot of that. I mean, the transgender stuff comes directly out of Israel. It seems like a lot of things are funded and come out of Israel, but it's so interesting because it's like, why now? Why are we going through this? Why has there been this big, Israel type of people waking up to this idea, right? Because it really came from the left on a lot of this stuff on college campuses, right? The free power.
Yeah, but the problem is that they always fall into the trap of anti-Semitism. I mean, one thing is the race, another thing is the ideology and the religion followed by that race. And if that religion becomes corrupted for a number of reasons, and you address those reasons like I do in this book, you are not condemning the people. You are actually, for example, in this book, I show how through the Sabbatean Frankists, they were the Sabbatean Frankists were the worst enemy of the Jews, and they themselves were Jews. Not all Sabbatean Frankists are Jews these days or in the last 100 or 200 years, but initially the Sabbatian heresy of Shabbatai Zevi, and then Jacob Frank, who claimed to be his reincarnation, these were Jews who would do anything against their own fellow Jew if they didn't accept their Messiah, including and that is, of course, the most controversial claim. But I cite rabbis, of course, for this, because otherwise would be accused of being a monster. The Holocaust, the Shoah. The Shoah and the transfer agreement that preceded it, that was made between the Zionist organizations and the Nazis. You have to understand that, like I said earlier, it was not easy to convince Jews to go back to Israel. So, first of all, in this book, I explain how the very idea of Zionism didn't really mature initially within Judaism. It matured in puritanical England, and then later on in Anglican England in the 19th century. Who was in charge of Palestine after the Ottoman Empire?
That I am not familiar with.
It was the English. It was an English protectorate, okay? So the English Freemasons, the Church of England, and before that, the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell. So my story goes all the way back to Oliver Cromwell, who was the only guy who beheaded the king and reigned with a republic in England for a limited amount of time. He got the English back to England after a few hundred years they had been casted out. And Manasseh ben Israel, who was himself this rabbi and Jewish printer, the first Jewish printer in the world with a Jewish print in the Netherlands, in Holland, he had this idea of, together with Cromwell, of bringing the Jews back to England and then back to Israel. And he himself didn't really generate, he wasn't really like he had invented this whole concept. This whole concept goes back to another gentleman who before him, this guy here, known as this French theologian called Isaac Lapierre, this guy here. This guy is Manasseh ben Israel, and this other guy is Israel Lapierre. Now, Manasseh ben Israel, sorry, you probably the camera went a little berserk with the...
You're back on focus.
Yes. Manasseh ben Israel at the end met with Oliver Cromwell, and the Jews who had been banned in the 13th century from England went back to England. So one thing is already there. It's concrete. It's not a conspiracy theory. Talking facts, historical facts. The entourage of Oliver Cromwell was very much into Manasseh ben Israel, and his secretary Sadler ended up writing a book and establishing what is known as British Israelism, which is they believe that the English and the Scots are like the lost tribe of Israel, which was a way to tame, in a way, all the anti-Semitism that had been present there. So before Manasseh ben Israel, this Isaac Lapierre, who was a Marranos. Now, Marranos is an important term because you have conversos and Marranos. And during the infamous years of the Spanish Inquisition, when the whole Iberic Peninsula was being purged of the Arab and Jewish influences, and then we know what happened later, because then you had Ignacio Loyola, the founding of the Jesuits and all that. But the Marranos were the ones who were crypto-Jews, who converted but were keeping on their Jewish practices in secret. While instead the conversos were genuine converts. So they stayed Catholics. And Lapierre had written a book in which he had pointed out that they needed to go back to Israel. So these are the very foundation. But then it was embraced by the Puritan world. And the Puritan world, the one that we saw then coming with the Mayflower here to the United States of America, didn't really embrace, Judaism but embraced the idea that by bringing the Jews back to Israel, they could finally have the return of Jesus and the end of times. This is the very basis of Christian Zionism here, no? So in my book, I explained all the various, let's say, misunderstandings that have been present to this day, because then Zionism eventually will be formalized with this name at the end of the 19th century, and with Theodor Herzl, they will create a movement. At that time, also, like I explained in my book, Judaism was very different. There was the secularized Jews, who were a product of the Sabbatean Frankist and the Illuminati and Freemasonry, who through the lodges of the Asiatic Brethren, and then later on also B'nai Brit, which was is also a very important element in our story. And then, of course, you have to understand that there was a rejection of the Jews within Freemasonry and the Illuminati initially. So the Jews had to kind of break through that blockage, okay? And they did, the first time they did it with this group called the Asiatic Brethren. And the Asiatic Brethren became also the link to Aleister Crowley, because the Asiatic Brethren is mentioned in the foundation documents of the OTO. And it becomes, and the Frater Lucis. So the Asiatic Brethren becomes that link also through Max Theon to Madame Blavatsky, the foundation of Theosophy, through Aleister Crowley and through the OTO, that then Crowley took over. Basically, in my book, I explain how the Sabbatean Frankist sexual magic was the basis for all the sexual magic of all the occultists that came later on, from Pascal Beverly Randolph to Crowley, all the way to the Satanism of Anton Levi, known as Anton LaVey, who was himself a direct descendant of Sabbatean Frankist. So you see, and he said the perfect Jew is a Nazi, a demon Jew, you know. So these are controversial, you know, you have to understand, these are very controversial subjects for people of Jewish faith. When you are stating in a book that, I mean, the transfer agreement, I don't know if you are familiar with the transfer agreement, but the transfer agreement, it took until the early 1980s for the Jews to be able to actually discuss it. 1980s, because before then they could hardly. It was Edwin Black who published a book in 1984, and he brought all the receipts, all the evidence, and then you know, then you see one thing. You see that basically the creation of Israel has nothing to do with the Jewish religion, but it's a compromise. Because, like I said, the Zionist movement had to put together the secularized Jew, the Orthodox Jew, the Sephardic, the Ashkenazi, the Yemen, you know, all the various Jewish people who had at that point scattered with the diaspora through the world, but also started to act differently. I mean, a guy like Franz Kafka, who, you know, an excellent writer, a secularized Jew who was viewing the Hasidic Jews as primitive and as a tribe of Africans, he said. So imagine what kind of racism there was between Jews. And that is really when the symbol of the I might have done an error in broadcasting on my Italian channel rather than the English channel. Sorry if I say that.
Brian Gable here in the chat. It seems like that whenever the Jewish people or Israel, when they get rejected, like what you're talking about, it always follows up with a war. We always have like a big war that kind of happens. You know, whenever they get kind of rejected, that's like, oh well, when our backs are against the wall. It's also kind of like the United States, right? When the United States is really down, we're in like a semi type of depression. The easiest way to get us out of that depression is to go to war, because war equals money, right? Money for the bankers. And it also seems like that whenever people start waking up to the amount of Israel/Jewish influence on other types of countries and starts to push them out, then it's wartime.
Yeah, but my book focuses mostly eventually on the creation of the banking cartel by the Sabbatean Frankists, on the triumphant entrance of Jacob Frank in Frankfurt, where, of course, he was embraced by people like the Rothschild and many other banking families that since then have made an extreme, they have made basically the success of their banking system. So my book doesn't really go into the detail of it explains, though. It explains how Israel was called a Sabbatean state by my late friend Barry Kamish, who used to be also a soldier within the IDF and who lived in Israel for many years. It has direct testimonies from Jewish sources who claim that the religion was corrupt by these people who no longer believed in their Mosaic laws, but started to create alternatives, which nowadays we find in that monstrosity, which is called Reform Judaism, which is prevalent in all. It's the biggest denomination here in the United States of America. And then you have the Reconstructionists, which are similar in a way of their approach, but originate from the conservatives. So there is not a single denomination of Judaism that has been in a way not manipulated. In fact, Rabbi Antelman used to say that even the definition Orthodox shouldn't exist because it was a construct which led also to a reaction. Hasidism, the Hasidic Jews, were born out of a reaction against the Sabbatean Frankists within their community in Eastern Europe, of the Ashkenazi in particular. So this reaction created after, the people we see today with their hair, funny hair and their thing and their very much, they claim orthodoxy. But we see then that, for example, some of the most progressive and deviant forces in Judaism today, like this transgender rabbi who I've mentioned today in an article I published on leozagami.com, Abi Stein, was actually born in an Orthodox family, and then after becoming a rabbi in 2012, graduating, went on to become a transgender, and now is a non-denominational Jew, which you see in this photo is actually involved with Judaism under the disguise of a woman. She's a man. For me, if you're born a man, you are a man. That's it. I'm not tolerating of this kind of rubbish. Okay, right. Let me be very clear. I'm a real conservative. Not this. These people demonstrate that nowadays, even if you're born within the realms of conservative Judaism, you are still, like this guy, completely confused. I mean, this guy is confused because he's supporting a guy who is viciously anti-Semite, who makes a mockery of Judaism. Aside from the fact that you support or not Israel, that's another thing. I'm talking about Zoran Mandani with his mockery. He dressed up and he made a rap to actually mock the Jews and the Jewish faith. So to support Zoran Mandani, for the people today who are about to go and vote, or have voted in the last few days, because you have, of course, maybe they already started voting in New York, and it's, of course, culminating with the possible election of Zoran Mandani. Well, I mean, it is completely contradicting the Jewish faith, but at the same time, there is actually a connection especially for those who have read my book, Volume 10 of my Confessions, which is the Islamic Freemasonry and the secret societies behind the eternal conflict in the Middle East. I actually dedicated the whole chapter at the end of this book to the Sabbatean Frankist and the infamous protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, to explain how things worked out, when it comes down to the protocols of Zion, we know that they came out of Russia, and in fact, it's actually not a coincidence that Jacob Frank, after he made his deal with the Catholic world, he actually in secret went to make another deal with the Orthodox and with the Tsar. At the time, I think it was probably Catherine the Great. I'm not sure if she was the Tsarina of Russia. But what happened was that he was eventually arrested by the Catholic Inquisition, and he was then liberated by the Russians after 13 years. And I explain in my book how he was kept for a period of time in the monastery of Czestochowa, where you have the Black Mary, which he then connected to the worship of the female Shekinah. And this, of course, becomes then the way that he then addresses as his successor his daughter, Eve Frank, who will become the first female Messiah. And that Shekinah will then be incarnated later on by Ghislaine Maxwell, because Robert Maxwell was himself a guy whose name, Robert Maxwell, is actually a construct of pure fiction. He's a hawk. He's a guy who comes from the Sabbatean Frankist, areas, and his real name brings us to the heart of the Sabbatean Frankist heresy. His name was, in fact, Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hawk, and his name was inspired by his own spy master, who was Maxwell Knight. So these are very interesting revelations. Also, in my book, I show an image of a young Robert Maxwell who wanted to be like Jacob Frank. He really even put the hat on and the mustache. Like he literally wanted to be like Jacob Frank. Let me see if I can watch. On the left, Robert Maxwell, father of Ghislaine Maxwell. On the right, Jacob Frank. Do they look similar?
Yeah, they do.
Okay, so there is very much interesting information in this book that I think a lot of people will appreciate. In regards to Robert Maxwell, he was connected to the future mega group, which started in the early 90s with Lex Wexner and with a number of Jewish people who are now the main financiers of AIPAC. So AIPAC today is very much discussed by people, but not many people discuss who is behind AIPAC. It's like there is always a manipulation upon a manipulation. And the mega group, did you ever study the mega group and the people within the mega group? Because the very interesting number of people who are involved with this mega group, from Steven Spielberg to others. So it's, in my book, I explain how you had, of course, various intelligence agencies like, both domestic, US and foreign, specifically Israeli Mossad, but also MI6. All these intelligence operatives were working with Lex Wexner, who had set up for him the cameras and the whole big mansion in New York. But then it's almost like they picked up, Donald Barr. People think, the father of William Barr is a Christian, is a Catholic. No, he converted like the Sabbatean Frankist at a late age. He was Jewish, Sabbatean Frankist descent. And he facilitated the entrance into the works of the sect, the present works of the sect. You see, when the Sabbatean Frankists started to be, let's say, under the spotlight of the rabbinical community, they very cleverly went out of the spotlight. In fact, the last known formal official document was made here in the United States, I think, at the end of the 19th century, and it's the last document we know about. Gershon Scholem also talks about it. But then we have other testimonies later on of the presence of the Sabbatean Frankists still within the Jewish community, and of a belief that was transmitted from father to son. The belief that there had been a trinity with Shabbatai Zevi, Baruch Russo, who was another guy who has a minor role, but was still, for a period of time, the leader of this sect before the Jacob Frank came around. And then you have Eve Frank, who was the daughter. And so this is basically where what brings us to then the mega group, because the mega group is also very close to the financial lodge of the B'nai Brit. And the B'nai Brit is this kind of quasi-paramasonic, it was like at the beginning of the 19th century in Germany, aside from the Asiatic Brethren, the Jews in Frankfurt couldn't really join the mainstream lodges. The Lodge of the Free Globes and the Prussian lodges, the Grand Lodge, they didn't let the Jews inside their lodges, okay? There had been a prohibition. So there had been this group, very influential, was the Asiatic Brethren for a period of time, and it was still ongoing. But then there were Jews who didn't want to necessarily join the Asiatic Brethren because they didn't believe in the Sabbatean Frankist teachings that were filtered for the Asiatic Brethren. And so they wanted to join some form of Freemasonry that was more regular. They couldn't manage. Eventually, they will manage in Germany, and they will actually go directly under the obedience of the United Grand Lodge of England. In the meantime, a group of German immigrants came to New York, and in New York, they founded the B'nai Brit. And the B'nai Brit, real meaning, like I explained in my book, is Sabbatai is my illumination. So today, B'nai Brit is the biggest fraternal organization. They have had for decades lodges in places like Hollywood, where they control the whole production of all and every film. And they have been the Sabbatean Frankist influence within Judaism, also in regards to Hollywood. The mega group, which was created in the study group, that was an informal group, today officially no longer in existence, had around 50 members. And amongst these 50 members, you had Charles Bronfman, who is this very important member of the Canadian Jewish Bronfman family, very influential. Then you had Max Fisher, who died in 2005, who was this American business and philanthropist, very close to both Dwight Eisenhower and George W. Bush. Then you had Michael Steinhardt, who was this billionaire hedge fund guy, who was called by Forbes the greatest trader, I think, of all time or something. He had a net worth of 1.1 billion when 1.1 billion was a lot of money. And then he was connected to the Wharton School, also of the University of Pennsylvania, which is another place important for that. Then you had Leonard Abramson, who was this guy very much connected with the Big Pharma. And he became, let's say, between the middle of the 70s to, I think, around 1996, he controlled American healthcare. These are the people I'm giving you that are Sabbatean Frankists, who are certified members of the mega group headed by Wexner, and that Jeffrey Epstein was working for. So I'm telling you name by name here. So write them down, put them, and then you had Harvey Meyerhoff, who was the chairman of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So, and he was also the founding chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Another guy.
What a coincidence, Leo. What a coincidence.
Let's not forget that the Anti-Defamation League was founded by the B'nai B'rith. So, you know, it's very risky to then put into discussion these figures. Here we're going to the mega group, but the mega group was like the inner circle. It became, and it still is to some extent, because it's still in existence regardless of what they say. And they are the core, you know, they are like the Supreme Council of the B'nai B'rith. So the B'nai B'rith, very important organization, up until the 1930s. They were more inclined to have a more Masonic regalia approach, you know, with all the fancy regalia, aprons, medallions, things, and all that. And they had, I think, a number of degrees that was reduced, I think, then at one point from 6 to, I don't know, 4 or something. They kind of shrunk the system because they wanted to be more practical. They then let also women in. There were various changes that were done within the B'nai B'rith. But B'nai B'rith became a mega organization, a massive organization. It's the biggest fraternal organization in the Jewish world, while the mega group was like the Illuminati of the Freemasons of the 18th century. When Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati as an elite group of Freemasons, well, the mega group founded itself a little bit like the Illuminati. So they were the Illuminati of the Jewish world. They are the Illuminati of the Jewish world. And that's really what built Jeffrey Epstein from scratch. We have also...
Now, was Jeffrey Epstein already a part of this group before he met Ghislaine Maxwell? Because you just mentioned that,
yes,
Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yes.
And
he met.
Oh, okay.
The father of Ghislaine was part of this group, so he met through Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter.
Okay, so he met Robert Maxwell, her father, before he met her. So he was already a part of this group, is what I'm trying to.
Absolutely, he was. I mean, he was recruited back in the first half of the 1970s because of his family background. His family background came from two parents who were the Stofolsky. I think the mother was Stofolsky and the father was Epstein, and both of them came from that area of Eastern Europe where the Sabbatean Frankists come from. And because, you see, so Donald Barr was at the time a guy who had had an experience already with the OSS. He had been an officer of the OSS. He then became a schoolmaster at the Dalton School, and he gave the possibility to Epstein to have a job as a math and science teacher without even having graduated. I mean, that is incredible in itself. You know, people are like, that is really what brings us back to the fact that journalists can't grasp this whole thing because they can't grasp the Sabbatean Frankists. When I explain today's player is in the Sabbatean Frankist wars, the connection with the banking system, I actually cite a research that was conducted also by my fellow journalist Ferruccio Pinotti, who I co-wrote a book with, Vaticano Massone. And one of the heads today is this guy here, John Elkann, who was guested at the Oval Office in May with the Juventus football team. Is the owner of Stellantis, Chrysler, Ferrari, Fiat, every single car you have here in America, almost. Not almost, but a lot of it. Jeep, and then goes on and on the list. And he is the guy who came through a marriage. The mother was this sister of this gentleman here, Gianni Agnelli. Gianni Agnelli was one of the most, he wasn't a Jew. He was actually one of the kings of Italian capitalism. He had conducted himself as the boss of Fiat, which was a very important car company at the time. And when the Elkans married into the Agnelli family, then I explain here some very mysterious things happened. And so suddenly the son of this guy, of Gianni Agnelli, who was supposed to be his heir, died in a very mysterious circumstances. He was thrown off a bridge. And then still to this day, the Elkans are in a controversial dispute over the inheritance, which the inheritance includes the major role into the holding company of Stellantis. But the Elkans are a race, a lineage, a dynasty, as when Trump introduced him in May, he said he is the heir of a very important dynasty. The dynasty is the Elkans that comes all the way from Frankfurt and Worms, and they are some of the most powerful rabbis of the Sabbatean Frankist heresy ever to exist. And they go back, of course, to Frankfurt, because Frankfurt, the Frankfurt is the place where Jacob Frank, like I said, came into before going to Offenbach am Main, and he came received like a king. The Rothschilds literally received him as a king. I mean, the guy was recognized as the Messiah at that point. So not all Jews recognized him, but those who recognized him became involved in the Sabbatean Frankist heresy, which is a very particular kind of heresy, because, and I demonstrate, like, for example, I go through all the names of the Black Book of Jeffrey Epstein, and one of the important names in Jeffrey Epstein Black Book is this gentleman here nobody knows about. And this guy here is Tiberto Rui Brandolini D'Adda, which then connects the Elkan family and the Agnelli family to the Black nobility, which was, and there is various names of the Black nobility in the Black Books of Jeffrey Epstein, the two Black Books. And Brandolini D'Adda, who is related to the Elkan and Agnelli, was also in charge of Stellantis until 10 years ago. So they're all connected here. And he was, him, and many others of the Black nobility were in Jeffrey Epstein Black Book. And I cite each one here in this book. And nobody does that in any other book I heard about Jeffrey Epstein around. You know, they discuss Jeffrey Epstein, but then they don't go through the Black Book and see who are these protagonists. I went through every single name. And this is, I think, very important. So I leave it to you now to any question you might have, because otherwise I take your questions out.
No, that's really good that you do that, that you cite all of your resources in there. Too many people don't do that. They just,
No, it's very important, because like I explained you earlier, you see, if you don't cite the sources and the credible sources that I have cited here, they will not take you seriously. I mean, when I'm talking about, I'm going to show you here one of the leading Sabbatean Frankists of the last 100 years, and you're going to inevitably tell me, who is this guy?
yeah.
You're going to tell me, no, I want to show you this guy, because once I explain you who he is, you will be shocked. And the influence he had in your government here in America, and you say, who is this guy? I don't know this guy. I never heard of this guy. I never saw this guy. But David Rockefeller called him the number one economist and the number one guy who did money in the world. So, I mean, he had the respect of David Rockefeller. Let me see if I can find him here.
Well, that's the thing, Leo, is that the people that really run the world you don't know who they are.
Yeah, and this is bravo. this is really what I wanted to do with this book. And that's why this book, I think, is gaining a lot of interest from colleagues in the journalist world who told me, Leo, it was really refreshing to see your take on the Epstein case, because nobody had gone into the ancestry of Jeffrey Epstein, of Ghislaine Maxwell, of all the other protagonists around him, the people in the Black Book, and then finally revealing these connections. And so this guy here, which I showed you, is the French-born American investment banker André Buena Mathieu. Watch. Do you know who this guy is?
I have no clue.
Advisor to Lyndon Johnson, dear friend and advisor to Kennedy, friend of Jacqueline Onassis, and of course, one of the people who was one phone call away from the White House in the most critical moments of recent history. And if you go on his, if we go on his Wikipedia, you will find a citation by David Rockefeller saying what he thought about that guy. You will be like, is David Rockefeller saying this guy is actually not him? This is the guy in charge? Wow. Yeah. So, like you said, and like another very infamous Sabbatean Frankist, the Israeli Prime Minister of Queen Victoria once said, the people who rule the world are very different from the ones now that you are commonly seeing in the spotlight.
And right, those are the fake players. Those are the fake people, the Bill Gateses and the Elon Musk. And
Bill Gates different. Bill Gates actually, I explain here in this book, apart from he might have been even the legitimate son of David Rockefeller, but he is connected to these people because of what he did and his career. In fact, there is a whole page here about when he brought John and Lapo Elkann to his headquarters, and he is also a guy who is a major stockholder in Stellantis. See? So, and you know, John Elkann is in the advisory board of Meta. He controls what you say or you don't say in Facebook.
Yeah, those types of people, you don't know who they are, because that's the easiest way to manipulate people and manipulate the world, is if you don't know who they are. Because then if you know who they are, you start pointing fingers at them, Leo, and they don't want fingers pointed at them. They want fingers pointed at the people that you can, point fingers at, like, oh, Elon Musk, oh, Bill Gates. Bill Gates he's the one that wants to do all this stuff. No, it's not. There's several people in behind.
Sure. I mean, he's part of the club, but he's not the head of the club, definitely. When there is many in this history which I have explained through, you have many rabbis, many schools of thought, many people who are questionable, others who have tried to stop this, even within Judaism. Is actually was important for me to make a whole chapter regarding the disinformation regarding the Khazarians. The Khazarians never existed because they existed, yes, as a race who embraced Judaism. But if I embrace Judaism, that doesn't make me a Jew. The DNA doesn't change in me. So there is a lot of confusion between the actual DNA, which is Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Yemeni, Ethiopian, which is actually Jewish DNA, and the fact that this group of people, the Khazari, embraced the Jewish faith. And I had to clear that up because there was a lot of confusion, in the internet about the Khazarians. Guys, sorry to tell you, but the Khazarians, first of all, are not related DNA-wise with the Ashkenazi. It's been proven. And I'm relating to the most credible sources for modern DNA research, which were not present maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, which led to this. Even within the Jewish world, there were rabbis who said there might have been a connection because they didn't have the modern technology to prove otherwise. But I wanted to prove otherwise because in this book I show that you can't blame, for example, a single group of people, like the Ashkenazis. People blame them for all the ills of the world. But in my story, I showed that at one point that they were the first rabbis who opposed the Sabbatean Frankists, the Sabbateans in particular, from the very time they started to rise in Thessaloniki. There was actually a big war waged against them. There was because the holy book of the Sabbatean Frankists is written by a rabbi called as Rabbi Heischutz. This rabbi, known as the rabbi of the free community, to this day, still the rabbinical community knows about the controversy. You can see it all over the internet, but you cannot question and confirm he was the author of the main Sabbatean Frankist text, because it will ruin the reputation of the rabbis. You see, the rabbis are very protective, so you have to go through very much detailed studies. But if you see Rabbi Heischutz, and he got in a very big controversy with these rabbis from the Ashkenazi community, who already at the time, even before him, had questioned the Sabbateans. I mean, question means that they issued rabbinical courts and they started to, because when you're talking about Sabbatean Frankist practices, you're talking to practices that were completely contrary to every Jewish law. Eating pork on holy days, orgies, borrowing your wife, swapping wives, making a ritual where each wife was a different letter of the Jewish alphabet, so they could do some Kabbalistic ritual. All this happened, and of course, it became a big problem for the Jewish community. So they tried to stop it when they could. They got in contact with the Christian authorities also and got them arrested. Some of these people were arrested. But in the end, I guess that they were not, I guess that when you have an heresy that takes place and somehow is successful, I mean, we talk about Donald Barr. And like I said, Donald Barr will be the guy who will give his first job to Jeffrey Epstein, who introduced him to the sect. Like you said, when did Jeffrey Epstein get introduced? In the early 70s by Donald Barr. Donald Barr will introduce him to the whole lot of people surrounding this sect. And Donald Barr had converted, he was from a Jewish family with roots hailed from the city of Berdichev, a major center of Hasidic Judaism in the 19th century. But every center of Hasidic Judaism in the 19th century had been infiltrated by the Sabbatean Frankists. So what did Donald Barr do? When he was an adult, he converted to the Catholic faith. And William Barr was brought up in the Catholic faith, not in the Jewish faith. And nobody even knows the real name of Donald Barr.
I hope you do. Do you know the real name of Donald Barr?
The real name of Donald Barr has never, the interesting thing with Donald Barr is that because of his intelligence roots in the OSS, he was able to really escape any trace of nobody knows it. We know, of course, that he was Jewish. We know that he has Sabbatean Frankist roots. But we don't really, is the only person that I couldn't find out if the real name, the real surname, because the name was probably Donald, but the real name was a little bit more difficult to find out. And so this also demonstrates, his full name was Donald Eli Barr. It could have been Eli. We know, though, that the modality in which he converted at a later age to the Catholic faith is a typical Sabbatean Frankist modality. And also, he wrote that infamous book, Space Relations, a year before employing Epstein, in which he lays out all the tenets of the Sabbatean Frankist faith. Have you ever heard of Space Relations?
No.
go and check it out on the Google, Donald Barr Space Relations, because this book is very important for you to read if you want to understand how insidious, it's a slightly gothic space opera, but it will give you an exact idea of what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell did in the years after that. It's about basically a society in space ruled by aristocrats, pedophiles, and all
Space
kinds.
Relations, a slightly gothic interplanetary tale.
Yes.
Yeah. Here it is on Amazon.
Yeah. And actually, like I explained in my book, you have a character in particular who is Lady Morgan, one of the protagonists, who indulges in acts of sadism, who must have been inspirational for Ghislaine Maxwell. We're talking about a science fiction novel, but in reality, it's like a camouflage science fiction novel because they indulge in child sex slavery. They indulge in every depraved act that was later followed by Jeffrey Epstein. And this is the father of the DOJ head when Jeffrey Epstein allegedly took his life.
Yeah,
So,
what do you believe happened there?
There's nothing to believe. Of course, they whacked him. They got him out of the way. Like I explained in my book, once you are not useful and you become a liability, you will be brought down and you will be taken out. But there is a particularity that, of course, people will have to read the book for more insight. But in regards to Ghislaine Maxwell, there is a very interesting insight on her role, and also the people who went to visit her this summer in the chapel of the prison where she now resides, a very luxury prison compared to where she was earlier. When I talk about these characters, you have to understand that I explain in my book, at the end, when people finish this book, they will realize that no matter who is in charge in the White House, you can place Bill Clinton, Trump, anybody, they will never be able to rule freely because these people have the banking cartel in their hands. And it's a little bit like the Jesuits have one side of the story with their control over the spiritual realm. Let's not forget that the Sabbatean Frankists spread from an area in which the Jesuits took refuge when they were banned from the Vatican in the same period. So there is a very strong connection between the Jesuits and the Sabbatean Frankists. The actual schools and colleges that kept on, because at one point the Vatican suppressed the Jesuit order, aside from those areas, which are the areas where the Sabbatean Frankists were. So, and of course, under the protection of the Empress of Russia, who is the same who then freed later on, who freed in the same period Jacob Frank because the Catholics had arrested him at one point, but the Orthodox will free them, and the Orthodox were at the time working with the Jesuits because paradoxically, the Empress gave the protection of the Orthodox Church to the Jesuits when they were kicked out of the Vatican. So, in my book, I explain the Sabbatean Frankists compromise the whole of the Abrahamic faiths, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. Of course, they are neither Muslim, Jewish, or Christians. They might be like somebody saying in the chat, Satanist of the left hand, but that is kind of a mad way of putting it, because when you see the kind of heresy that they were proposing, is much more vast.
What do you think of the people that have died that were blowing the whistle on Jeffrey Epstein? There's been several of them that's died. There's been reports of over 24 people that's been linked to the Epstein clay associates, witnesses, journalists. Virginia Giuffre just Caroline Andriano, which testified in against
Well, I
Maxwell also died in 2023.
Sure.
Leah Patrick, she died in 2017, which was another outspoken person against.
You're basically stating what I said in the introduction to the book. There has been a bunch of suicides, between brackets, since the beginning of this whole saga. Let's not forget that Jeffrey Epstein, Jean-Luc Brunel, who provided him with 1,000 minors, and Ghislaine Maxwell were the only ones to be arrested. And the only one to survive is Ghislaine Maxwell, because Ghislaine Maxwell has compromised herself, of course, to stay alive. But Jean-Luc Brunel and Jeffrey Epstein were, of course, suicided. Virginia Giuffre stated some very important things in the book that just came out, the memoir, which I also cite. The relevance of Virginia's testimony is mostly because it is really about her own intimate and private and direct experience, which gives it an extra additional, strength. But there is some very important elements that, of course, then need to be. Okay, she didn't want to give the names in this book, in this memoir, even if posthumous, to not create legal troubles. But you can find easily those names because she actually gave the testimony to the FBI and the authorities. So you can go in parallel and find, for example, the prime minister that brutally raped her, that she's talking about, is Ehud Barak. And he was the one who visited Jeffrey Epstein even after he was condemned many, many times. He worked with Epstein to even reach Russia in regards to eventually deposing Assad in Syria. Imagine, Jeffrey Epstein was doing this kind of things, but at the same time, Ehud Barak brutally raped her. Brutally. I mean, she said that it was the worst thing that ever happened to her, what Ehud Barak did. And Ehud Barak, like I explained in my book, is the typical product of labor Zionism, which is in itself a monstrosity. You see, like I said, Zionism is a compromise. That's why you have the real symbol of the Jews is the menorah. That is the real symbol of Israel. But when they created this symbol with the 6 star, which is the seal of Solomon, which was also present, of course, in the grimoires and so on, that was a compromise, which means one side of Israel meets the other side, the side of the secularized, the intellectually advanced, the ones that extracted Karl Marx, who was one of them, like Moses Mendelssohn. I mean, that part of the Jewish people, like I stated earlier, saw, like Frank Kafka, the other part as some kind of primitives. So there had to be a compromise in order to bring these Jews to believe they could then go back to Israel. They had tried to convince them for a long time. And I tell you, up until the early 30s, in Germany, nobody wanted to go to Israel. It was when the transfer agreement came along, and when eventually some people refused the transfer agreement, refused to go, because they were Jews. The Jews were persecuted in a way with the support of the Sabbatean Frankists, with the pogroms in Russia, then the Holocaust, the Shoah. But up until 1933, even when Adolf Hitler got elected, the B'nai Brit did nothing to stop them. And in the end, there was the transfer agreement, and the transfer agreement was that, known also as the Havar Agreement in Hebrew, is that very controversial agreement between Nazi Germany and Zionist organizations, signed in August 1933, which was finalized by the Zionist Federation of Germany, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, which is an Israel bank controlled by the Sabbatean Frankists, that can be traced to Herzl visionary track der Judenstaat, and the actual economic authorities of Nazi Germany. And basically, it made the migration possible for those 60,000 German Jews who accepted all this and decided to go back to Palestine. The other ones were sent to concentration camps. They were sent to the worst possible ending ever, the biggest crime in humanity, the Shoah, that was devised by the Sabbatean Frankists together with the Nazis. Let's not forget that Adolf Hitler was himself partly a Jew.
That's the little detail that
Sorry?
The whole thing be like, oh my God.
Well, it's pretty shocking when you know that, for example, Rabbi Antelman stated that Adolf Hitler was the product of a Sabbatean Frankist ritual in 1888. And I repeat, that might be questionable because people might say, I don't have the evidence for it. But the actual transfer agreement, there is plenty of evidence. And it was criticized by the revisionist Zionists, of course, who are the guys who nowadays revisionist Zionism is like the Likud party. But when you see, okay, you have the Balfour Declaration, you have the Jews pushed to go back to Israel in one way or another, because when these same Jews will try to come to America, they will be sent back. When they try to enter England at that point, they will be sent back. They couldn't go anywhere. They want to force them towards recolonizing Israel. It was a plan that, like I said earlier, started a few hundred years earlier with the Puritans. So today we have the state of Israel, and it's a reality. It's a reality that can't be, you can't say from the river to the sea, I want all these guys to just remove themselves from where they are. Because, first of all, both the Jews as well as the indigenous Arabs who live there, they are both indigenous. And this is something that both Arabs and Israeli and Jews need to recognize about each other. They're both indigenous of there. But at the same time, of course, they were forced, a lot of Jews, to go there. And now that they are there, you can't kick them out. Where are you going to send them? To another planet? They have been already the victims of so much manipulation. I mean, like Ryan is saying, the Avar Agreement, it is a fascinating document because it shows that basically the Jews have made a deal with the devil in order to not only survive, but to survive with their finances intact. And not everybody accepted that. And unfortunately, the ones who didn't accept it ended up with the Nazi party not only confiscating everything, but also sending them to the concentration camps. So it's a very sad situation because, you are at the heart here of what is known as the Jewish question. But the expression of this anti-Semitic movement, if we follow it from the 1880s all the way to the 1930s, is a product of the Sabbatean Frankists, or people like, also behind the scene, the Rothschild and many other banking families, the Warburg, the Schiff. The Schiff gave the money to Leon Trotsky to bring down the Tsars. This is history. I mean, this is stated in history books. The Schiff, Jacob Schiff, gave his money to Leon Trotsky to bring down the Tsar. Why? Because the Tsar himself had then been played also by the Sabbatean Frankists through the Martinist order. The Martinist order and the Louis de Cohen goes back to a guy called Martinez de Pasquali, who himself was connected to the Marranos and the Sabbateans. Have you ever heard of the Louis de Cohen, of the Martinists, of the Martinezes, of Claude de Saint-Martin? Because these are the people who are very influential also in the early stages of the French Revolution. But there was, in the early stages of the French Revolution, another guy who was very influential, which I discuss in my book, and that guy was Moses Dobrusca. Have you ever heard of Moses Dobrusca?
No.
Moses Dobrusca had a few names. He was known as Junius Frey, Moses Dobrusca, and many other names. He ended up on the guillotine. But when he was Moses Dobrusca and then he became nobilitated, he became one of the key members of the Asiatic Brethren. And he was the grandson of the rabbi who created the most holy book for the Sabbateans, Rabbi Eberschutz. Now, the mother of Moses Dobrusca was the first cousin of Jacob Frank. So you see, it's all within the family. And he's the guy who invented La Philosophie Sociale, which is then the basis for all the various inspiration that launched. The Philosophie Sociale is fundamental for the French Revolution. But Moses Dobrusca is an important guy that nobody talks about in history. He was then nobilitated with the name Franz Thomas Eder von Schoenfeld, and together with Ephraim Joseph Hirschfeld, is a bit Hirschfeld, they became very much involved in the German Jewish mystic enlightenment. And like I said, the Asiatic Brethren was a very important order because the Asiatic Brethren, known as the Knights of St. John the Evangelist from Asia and Europe, was the first order that opened, the first order of Freemasons and of Illuminati who let the Jews inside the lodges. In a pivotal moment in time, because we're talking about the eve of the French Revolution here. And then they became main protagonists of it. Now, in the Asiatic Brethren, they teach the principle of Sabbatean Frankist heresy. So I think that that gives you an idea of the influence that they had within the Masonic world. They were very important with their work, because the founder of this order was a guy called Hans Erich von Hescher-Unghofen. Now, this guy was not a Jew, but he was the head of an order of aristocrats guided by the Jesuits. And because of his very powerful stand within the Catholic world, I mean, you're talking here about a top-notch, let's say, of the Illuminati. He died in 1790. He was born in 1750, so he didn't live that much. But in fact, he died when he went against Moses Dobrusca and those other guys from the Sabbatean Frankists. You know, he had a moment in which he saw the situation maybe not very clear. He had accepted their teachings up to a certain extent. Then when he didn't accept them, suddenly he's whacked. And at that point, though, I mean, but the other important figure that was also in charge of the order was this very important other aristocrat from the Karl von Hessen-Kassel, who was himself a prince of the situation there. in Prussia. And so these people, what they did was that they understood the magical powers that the Sabbatean Frankists had. That is another subject which I discuss in my book, of great importance. The fact that the Sabbatean Frankists had a lot of magical power. And in fact, biggest disciples of the Sabbatean Frankists were the Illuminati. And one of the main people within the Sabbatean Frankists known for his magical powers was this gentleman here. You see, with a compass and a square?
Yes.
Known as Dr. Falk. He was the teacher of Emanuel Swedenborg and of Count Cagliostro. And he had made the magical ring of the Prince of Orleans. So this guy here was very powerful. And he was openly accused of being a Sabbatean. He had to take refuge in London. And then in London, he will be protected by one of the biggest family of bankers from Frankfurt. So you see that the fact that the banking system goes along with these people, it's not only in the Rothschild, it's always like very much, and it brings always to Frankfurt, which was very much the epicenter of this Sabbatean Frankist heresy.
Well, I think you answered my most important question, which was who's responsible for all this, and it's themselves. They're doing it to themselves.
Yes. You know, and in fact, we go back to the answer that Roseanne Barr gave me once. The worst enemy of the Jews is the Jew. But you have to understand that it's not the Jewish race, but rather the ideology and the religion that subverted their own faith. If they respected those Mosaic laws, they might have stayed intact. But of course, when you see today Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, progressive Judaism, and even conservative Judaism picking up their own, which laws to believe and which ones they can disregard, that is not tolerated. In fact, Rabbi Antelman said one thing which is important here. There should be only one form of Judaism. The rest is an artificial construct. So the moment in which you start saying, what kind of Judaism are you following? It doesn't make any sense. Either you follow it or you don't follow it. And unfortunately, today, here in America, the people who, for example, with AIPAC control and push, and also in Israel is a Sabbatean state. But it's not me who states that. But it's rather the late Barry Kamish, who was my friend, and who wrote some excellent books in this regard, and who was also a friend of Rabbi Antelman. And I think that they were up in... and I really had this, even recently when this book came out, people will say, Leo, you have to be very careful because you're not Jewish. They might say you're anti-Semite. I mean, I have a very little Jewish blood in my veins, but I mean, you might very easily be accused of anti-Semite. And that's why I made sure from the very presentation of the book onwards to stress the fact that we are not criticizing a race here. But we are it's like if you are Catholic, I can't criticize you because you are Catholic. But if you are a Catholic that believes in all the bullshit spewed by the Jesuit mafia and the Second Vatican Council, you are just as bad. The thing is that for the Illuminati, we call them the Illuminati, we can call them in many other ways, the mystery schools that which commonly refer to as the Illuminati, the first thing to control is the religions. And this happened very easily also, like I explained in volume 10, with the Islamic faith. From the moment Muhammad died, and you have, of course, the Shia with the cousin Ali, and then from the Shia you have the Fatimid, and then you have many others. And and the assassins and this and that, and you have basically different kinds of ways of interpreting the same book. But why? Because divide et impera, as the Latin said. Divide and conquer. We divide and we conquer. We divide them and we are able to control them better. Nowadays, of course, what is the intention of the Jesuits and the Vatican since Pope Francis? To unite all the religions, to bring them together, from the Abu Dhabi Fraternity Agreement to the encyclica in 2020, Fratelli Tutti, all brothers, to then going to the Sunni and then the Shia community in Iraq in the middle of the pandemic, and then the Buddhists, the Jews, and blah, blah, blah. And nowadays, of course, we have seen with the King Charles going to the Vatican, the ultimate move. After 500 years, the main enemy that fomented even the birth of the Jesuits, because that's what happened in the early 16th century when the Jesuits were created. There was Martin Luther, then there was the Church of England, and there were the real enemies. Now, the new Pope, with the Jesuits behind him, because even if he's an Augustinian, he's still working with the Jesuits and for the Jesuits, and with the Freemasons, they're putting together this new plan of a one-world religion, which is also a Sabbatean Frankist plan. So on one side, you have the banking cartel, which is alive and kicking, is controlling Hollywood, is controlling the media, and so on. On the other, you have the Jesuits, but they work hand in hand. When you have Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is presented by the Jesuit America Review in 2018 to the world before entering in a bombastic way the political scene and possibly becoming, the future candidate for the Democratic Party. It's even Zoran Mandani is the typical product. Islamo-communism is a reality that can exist only here in the West, because if you bring a transgender in Gaza, he will be killed after 3 minutes, maybe 5, and then thrown off the roof. There's no tolerance for this kind of thing in the Middle East. But here in the West, you have this great mix, putting together the globalists, the extremes, the woke and the Muslim. I don't know. The mix made out of compromises that will not make any sense in logic.
You know what I think that is, Leo? I think the transgender ideology and the reason that it's blooming is for transhumanism. So whenever it comes to the point to where we are, merging man with machine, which we're starting to see
that is something I dedicated 3 books to, volume 6.66, volume 7, volume 9, about transgender and transhumanism, AI, cyber Satan. For me, it's stuff which I already discussed.
Right, but I think that is the goal is so whenever that stuff comes, you don't have any of those laws anymore. People have already accepted that transgender ideology, so therefore there's nothing to get around when it comes to transhumanism and the time to
absolutely. I've always in my books anticipated that was the case, and in fact then when this Pope came along, he introduced himself as the Pope for the AI revolution, just as Pope Leo XIII was the Pope for the Industrial Revolution. So it makes sense, as I described in my books, volume 7, also volume 6.66, and volume 9, that focuses also on the quantum computers, that it is important to realize that the future of religion is also with the AI and robotics. So this is really what is happening. And in regards to what Ryan said, that the Mosaic laws are not unique, they are not maybe original or unique, but respecting them would have been more coherent. We are not discussing if they are unique or if they come from Gerald Massey said ancient Egypt, and somebody who studies the book of the beginnings knows this very well. Or if we want to discuss the fact that British Israelism is built out of thin air with this kind of crap, with the Anglo-Saxon race being the lost tribe of Israel, or the Druids being in line with Judaism. We are here in front of a guy who is Jeffrey Epstein, who is a product of all this. And that's why he got along with the British royal family like a house on fire. And the results of it nowadays is the decline of the Windsors themselves. So I hope that we have cleared a lot of your questions. I'm glad that we were able to have such an intelligent discussion today.
Yes, thank you very much, Leo. Really appreciate it. You're always welcome on here to discuss whatever you would like to discuss.
And
anybody on this channel, Leo, there's no censorship here. But can you let people know where to find your website, what your website is, and where they can purchase your book?
The leozagami.com website with all my latest articles has the link for my latest book, and you can also find my latest book, which is The Rise and Fall of a Frankist Monster, on Amazon.com. And of course, in regards to Zoran Mandani, it's obvious that they are Jewish. They are Sabbatean Frankists, though. That we need to specify. Don't fall, Ryan, or other people, researchers who are following me now, into the trap of anti-Semitism. Because one thing is a race of people, and going against a race means being racist. Going against an ideology or a religion, or a sect in this case, was given birth to all the monstrosities of Zionism. That is much more intelligent and will be respected by the Jews themselves when they understand what kind of manipulation they've been subject to. So thank you so much for having me on. God bless you, Ryder, and take care.
Thank you very much, Leo. The links to Leo's website is in the description of this video. And thanks everyone here in the chat. Really appreciate each and every single one of you. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel and the algorithm. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.